Hi everyone, good morning. I was listening to a radio producer the other day saying that you should never start with hi everyone because you should make everyone feel like you're talking directly to them. And then I realised that I do that every single week, so hello to every individual person that is watching. My name is Lorna McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 archive centres across the Highlands of Scotland in Inverness, Wick, Portree and Fort William. And together those 4 offices look after historic documents relating to the Highlands of Scotland going back around 700 years, and we're adding to our collections all the time. This series, as you will know, is brought to you by HighLife Highland at no cost to the viewer. HighLife Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, as I always say, I know that many of you have done, and we're very grateful for that, so thank you. You'll be delighted to hear that today is the second day in 2 months that I have woken up without that sore throat, so we're on the mend, but I still have a bottle of water just in case. I hope you can hear me clearly. I've had a couple of issues with my computer this morning, so I'm hoping that I stay with you for the whole half hour. So this week we are looking at one of the privately deposited collections held at the Highland Archive Centre. This time it's not a collection that has been given to us by a family or by an individual or an estate or a business, but this time it's a collection that's been given to us by an organisation, a society. The Northern Meeting, an organisation which is still very much in existence today. And the Northern Meeting will be something that, if you're from the Highlands or from Inverness particularly, you'll maybe be familiar with the Northern Meeting. If you are from further afield, then that may mean not very much to you. And I'll come on and tell you some of the story of the Northern Meeting. This is a large collection that we hold in Inverness in our archive centre. It's 37 boxes and 14 folders, plus all the outsized things that don't fit in those boxes. So it's a big collection, and it covers a long time period. It covers from 1594 through to 2011. Now, as we would expect from a collection that covers such a wide date range, it has material on parchment, in paper, in microfilm and photograph, and also digital files. So aside from the content that is in it, it's a very diverse collection across dates and across materials. Now, although the collection has items dating from the previous centuries, and I mentioned there the 1500s, the Northern Meeting itself, in fact, dates from the 1700s, from 1788. And the things that in the collection that date prior to that are things that they have amassed along the way, which I'll touch on as we go on. So what is the Northern Meeting? How did it start? I'm sure that some people watching will know, so feel free to pitch in with what you know about the Northern Meeting, or maybe the Northern Meeting Park. Well, in order to write this talk, I'm using this book. This is a book by Angus Ferry, written predominantly from that 37 box collection that we now hold, as well as some other material from individuals. The book is called The Northern Meeting. As I say, it's written by Angus Ferry, and it was written to celebrate the bicentenary of the Northern Meeting. And this is a very obvious route in, because this is, as I say, written largely from the official records that we hold. And so I have used this extensively in writing this talk. But the material that was used to write that is held in our archive centres. So I wanted to start by setting the scene about the Northern Meeting by sharing some of the opening paragraphs from that book. The aftermath of the 45. There has probably never been a lower point in the history of Inverness than the defeat in 1746 of the Jacobite Rising. The shock of Culloden, the horrific reprisals and repressive legislation that followed, and the stranglehold of military occupation made it difficult to find anything to be cheerful about. For several years, as the town of Inverness tried to revive its shattered economy, the only glimmer of prosperity was the extensive building site on the promontory of Ardasir, where John Adam, Master Mason to the Board of Ordnance of Great Britain, spent from 1747 to 1769 constructing Fort George. Few can have welcomed the appearance of this gigantic artillery fortification, conceived as it was as an intimidating symbol of military authority, but it did have the great merit of generating in peace a considerable amount of business for local merchants, tradesmen and ship owners, as well as employment for hundreds of labourers and farm workers. In those early days, Inverness did not offer visitors the picture postcard welcome of today. The town, still dominated by the crumbling piles of rubble on Castle Hill, where Prince Charlie had opportunely demolished the medieval castle in the 18th century barracks, probably seemed little better than a cheerless, run-down outpost devoid of comfort and congeniality. But Inverness, with its unique mixture of races, has always had vitality. By the 1780s, bolstered by the government spending on Fort George, it had become a bustling go-ahead community of over 9,000 inhabitants, to which a fair degree of prosperity and confidence had already returned. The harbour was thriving, a new fisher town had been laid out, businesses were starting up, and wealthy merchants were building elegant houses on the outskirts of the town. So we find Inverness at a point in the 1740s onwards of devastation across the country, regardless of which side you had been on the Jacobite risings. The Highlands and the wider country are at a point of crisis. Coming ahead a couple of decades, things are starting to pick up, and the book goes on. It was a combination of the rise in the fortunes of Inverness bringing improvement to its hotels, together with the persistent problems of travel, that prompted 13 Highland gentlemen to meet at Inverness on the 11th of June 1788 to discuss how, with a bit of imagination, social life in the north could be livened up a bit. The Minute Book records that after a conversation at length on the subject, they resolved to hold an annual meeting for the purpose of promoting a social intercourse. So all of these things have culminated to bring these 13 gentlemen together to go, what can we do to move the social scene in the Highlands forwards? The duration of their conversation at length is not mentioned, but in managing to agree on 24 specific resolutions about how the Northern Meeting should be run, the 13 founders achieved a degree of unanimity which has seldom occurred in any subsequent deliberation of the Northern Meeting. When Dr. John Aves, the first secretary, came to put the decisions of the meeting on record, he had no secretarial art or training. The minutes, by comparison of the conventions of modern committee procedure, are rambling and inconsequential series of ideas, but the punchline is there, that as the object of the meeting is pleasure and innocent amusement. And it goes on to say that this was a very deliberate aim to cultivate a society, a group of people who could enjoy themselves, who could have pleasure and amusement. His words were well and deliberately chosen. The death of Prince Charlie in January 1788 was a bitter reminder that only 42 years earlier the country had been violently split by a wretched civil war, the repercussions of which were still bringing the social miseries of bankruptcy, the sale of historic estates, controversial agricultural methods, and mass emigration. Sited at Inverness, the apex of the theatre of war, the Northern Meeting was consciously intended to be a happy social occasion, free from all political or business matters, a gathering at which old families and old friends could meet and enjoy themselves, forgetting for a week at least the divisive preoccupations of personal fortune or misfortune. So that the aim of that, therefore, is to bring together people to take a breath from the situation that the Highlands found themselves in. A society born out of the conflict of the Jacobite risings and all of the pain and turmoil and upset and legislation that had followed that. It was a group created also to try and smooth some of those differences through shared things like music and dance and hunting and social activities. Membership from the very beginning was open to those across the political divide, so regardless of what their affiliation had been or their allegiances had been during the 45. And when you think about that, that's really quite a bold decision to take, to set up a society that says, we've very recently had a war, but everyone is welcome to this, whatever side you took. That's quite interesting if you try and think about a modern parallel of that. I mentioned there that Bonnie Prince Charlie had died in 1788, and with him really the swell of support for the Jacobite Rising. It didn't die out completely, but it starts very much to taper off. Also, the Act of Prescription had been repealed in 1782. Now, the Act of Prescription included the Dress Act, which was that banning of wearing of tartan and Highland dress and so on, and that had been repealed in 1782. So there were things happening that were diluting some of the tensions of the Jacobite risings. The plan that the 13 gentlemen brought together at that first meeting was to hold a week-long meet with dinner that would be served from 4 till 6:30 at a local hotel or inn, and then followed by dancing from 8 p.m. in the townhouse. And during the week there would also be activities and hunts and social activities to take part in. That use of the townhouse for the balls gives us another one of those intersections that I always talk about between collections. Using the records of the Northern Meeting tells you about that decision to use the townhouse for the dances. But by referring to the Borough and Town Council minutes, you can start to see the intersection. So of course they're recording interactions with the Northern Meeting in their minute books as well. So it's always worth, and I know I have battered on about this for over 2 years with you now, but it's always worth looking across collections to see how you can enrich the information that you're looking at. It's interesting to note some of the decisions that were taken early on to integrate all those different political sides. So annual subscriptions were a guinea, around £50 a year, so an annual subscription. So that's not very much. And the reason for that was that they didn't want to exclude people who had suffered financially, perhaps as a result of the Jacobite risings, of backing the wrong side in the 45 and losing estates or money. So there's an aim to include everybody. Now, it absolutely did not include everybody, of course, which I'll come back to in a second, but a way of trying to make it inclusive. There was also a rule prohibiting any talk of work, so people couldn't use the opportunity to get some business deals done. And by the October of that year, nearly 80 people had applied to join, and there were professionals such as lawyers and doctors and bankers and so on. There were merchants and excisemen, but predominantly there were landowners, and that's what I mean when I say it's inclusive, but it's inclusive at this point at a certain level of society. Town officials also were involved and were members. The first Northern meeting started on the 27th of October 1788, and 64 of the members were in attendance with their families. So it was very clear from early on that there was potential in this idea. Within 12 months of its formation, the Northern Meeting office bearers were keen to construct their own meeting rooms. So they were using the townhouse, but they thought perhaps if we're going to carry on and we're going to have this society, we could have our own meeting rooms with a ballroom, with a dining room, a kitchen, and so on. And a site was found on the corner of Church Street and Baron Taylor Street, right in the middle of Inverness. And I don't know if any of you remember the Northern meeting rooms. If you do, please tell me. I've seen pictures, but I'm desperately hoping to see a colour picture of the inside, because the black and white picture I've seen of the inside looks spectacular. So I'm hoping someone somewhere has got a colour picture of the interior. Now, building these meeting rooms was a huge undertaking, a huge financial undertaking, and it turned into quite a problematic undertaking, with several individual members having to contribute substantial amounts, including William Ingalls, who I've mentioned on several occasions before, who was one of the provosts of Inverness, an important figure involved in founding a lot of organisations and institutions. The Northern meeting rooms were completed and they were finally ready for use in about 1793-94, and they were used for a few years until all of that money and effort and blood, sweat and tears, despite all of that, this happened. This is another extract from Angus Ferry's book. By the turn of the century, so into the 1800s, the Northern meeting was well established with its own assembly rooms and a regular annual routine. But in 1801, a foreseeable disaster occurred. An unforeseeable disaster occurred. The building at the back of the Northern meeting rooms in the Black Vennel, which is now what we call Baron Taylor Street, housed a soup kitchen and the shop of a candle maker, a forest man named Robin Goodwin, or Robin Goodfellow. On the 12th of March 1801, when Goodwin was out for a convivial dram, his tallow kettle boiled over and the building caught fire. What few people realised was that the town council happened to be using the rooms above the candlemaker's shop as a gunpowder store, and as the fire reached the attic, 8.5 barrels of gunpowder blew up. It was fortunate that the explosion happened at the top of the building, and so the blast went mainly upwards, but the effect, nevertheless, was shattering. Between 7 and 14 people were killed, accounts vary, and many others injured, while the centre of Inverness, although not flattened, suffered much damage to the buildings and lost all its windows. The miserable Robin Goodwin fled the town and was not heard of again until he was found dead in the River Clyde in 1818. No building suffered worse than the northern meeting rooms, which were next door to the bang. When the rueful stewards inspected their pride and joy, they found the top story and the roof devastated, the kitchen and the outside stairs to the music gallery gone, while inside the building the chandeliers were shattered and the woodwork and plaster badly damaged. However, the setback brought no spirit of defeatism to the society, and at a meeting of members held 3 weeks later, the stewards were given full authority to have the rooms repaired in time for the annual meeting in October. When it came to identifying who had been responsible and who should be pressed for compensation, the case could hardly have been more clear-cut. The candlemaker's shop had belonged to a firm Messrs. Mackintosh, Ingalls and Wilson. By coincidence, the town councillors who had so casually stored the gunpowder above the shop were Provost Mackintosh, ex-Provost Ingalls, and Baillie Wilson. The position of the Northern Meeting, as recorded in the minutes, was clear. This is what the minutes say. The negligence of Messrs. Mackintosh, Ingalls and Wilson in keeping a magazine of gunpowder in their candle house was sufficient grounds for subjecting the said company to pecuniary damages, and the Northern Meeting would insist on the reparation of the loss in the legal manner unless the company came forward handsomely with an offer of a sum of money. Imagine going, all right, so who owns the candle shop? All right, that's those 3 men. And who owns the gunpowder above it? Oh, same people. That's excellent. And they're all councillor on the town council, and they're all involved in the Northern Meeting. I think they're all involved in the Northern Meeting. The caution in the official position of the Northern Meeting disguised the embarrassing fact, yes, they were, that Provost Mackintosh, ex-Provost Ingalls and Baillie Wilson were all enthusiastic and respected members of the society. And it's nice to be able to record that their behaviour in the circumstances was beyond reproach. They agreed that they would settle without any legal compunction. And just to be on the safe side, the Northern Meeting instructed its solicitor to take the opinion of the Solicitor General, and they also retained legal advice on it. But the 3 red-faced town councillors agreed to pay £318 for the cost of repairs, and they probably felt that it was as inexpensive a way of protecting their names as could have been expected. It's a great, well, it's a horrible, tragic story, but there's a little bit of humour about the realisation that these 3 men are so central to it. It was repaired in about a year or so and continued to be used. In the late 1810s into the early 1820s, in addition to the true Highland Games that you might remember me talking about when I did a short talk about Highland Games in July, the committee turned their hand to the creation of a racecourse as an extra activity for the Northern Meeting Week. Now, racing had been happening at Fort George, but Affleck Fraser of Culduthel, who from 1820-21 was the secretary, offered to create a racecourse at Dunane Croy, and there is still a part of that land that's referred to as Racecourse Wood. And that was a great success, and apparently there were 300 people at the ball that year who also attended and came to take part in the races and so on. Now, I mentioned that there were problems with the finances in building the Northern Meeting Rooms, and that continues to be an ongoing problem, and we see that in every organisation, society, club that has as long a history, that there are peaks and troughs of finances. And this continued to be an ongoing problem at this point for the Northern Meeting. There were debts and arrears, and the fortunes of the Northern Meeting ebbed and flowed. When we come to the 1830s, this brings in what would be the first official Highland Games organised by the Northern Meeting, a tradition that continued in various guises and has continued throughout the centuries. Here's an extract from the book that talks about the foundation of the Highland Games and also something else that has become absolutely synonymous with the Northern Meeting. In a very short time, the public games became the most popular annual event in Inverness. Nobody could have foreseen how admirably they suited everyone's requirements. They provided a social gathering that was fun for members of the Northern Meeting, not only as spectators, but as organisers and judges, and in providing an opportunity for the general public to benefit from the organising ability and financial backing of the lairds. They had philanthropic value as well. With the games firmly established, the Stuarts determined that they should not dwindle away through lack of support once the early enthusiasm had worn off, as had happened in the case of the races. Indeed, during the entire existence of the games, their programme always included novel ideas that provided amusement and talking points for the members and maintained strong attendance and public support. In 1840, the list of activities was extended even further to include a touch of culture, with 2 concerts in the town hall, where the Inverness Militia Band played, and Mr. Mackenzie and his brother from Edinburgh gave concerto solos. There was novelty in the evening too, when at one of the balls in 1841, the ladies wore fancy dress of Spanish, Swiss or ancient English costume. Of all the innovations, the most significant was the new event of 1841, described as an exhibition of pipers and dancers. It was the seed that was to grow into the well-established piping competitions of today. The institution of the games and then the addition of the piping competitions started an era of splendid stability. And so we find ourselves in the 1840s and 1850s with the games taking place and the piping championships and competitions taking place, as well as the balls and the dinners and the other events. The games were held in various sites, but they were clearly popular, and so in 1864 the Northern Meeting decided to purchase a site, a part of land specifically for the purpose of hosting the games, and what became known as the Northern Meeting Park was established. And as I said at the beginning, anyone who is in and around Inverness will be familiar with the Northern Meeting Park, still very much a focal place for the community for events such as Hogmanay. And this is an extract from Angus Ferry's book that talks about the establishment of the Northern Meeting Park. With its own sports ground to use as it wished, the Northern Meeting set about establishing a proper home for the games. The annual general meeting of 1864 authorised the Committee of Management to build a permanent pavilion big enough to hold up to 1,000 people. Under the vigorous leadership of Lord Lovat and the convener Henry White, plans were prepared, estimates produced and bank loans arranged. As one bright idea led to another, it was probably fortunate for the Northern Meeting that the terms of the few were restrictive, so that's the legal document governing what the land could be used for. Alexander Matheson had very firm ideas on how his property should be used, and the few precluded building public houses, shops or dwelling houses, although he did agree to allow the plans to include respectable shops. By the time of the Games in September 1865, the Northern Meeting had put up £1,709 for the impressive pavilion which still stands in Ardross Street today. Despite the daunting capital outlay, the new site made a lot of sense financially. The Northern Meeting no longer had the expense of building each year a large wooden pavilion which only had 2 days' use before it was demolished again. The 8-foot wall around the ground allowed tight control of access. Not only could the staff and the constabulary on duty at the gate keep out the inevitable drunks and other defaulters, but the admission fees produced a steady income, which even resulted in the games running at a modest annual surplus. During the rest of the year, the ground produced a small return through a lease to the Inverness Cricket Club in the summer and from grazing sheep in the winter. And there's a few really interesting things in there. One is that absolutely the Northern Meeting Pavilion still stands. Even this book was written in 88, but it still stands and is in use today. The site, as I mentioned, is still used regularly for things such as mini festivals, Hogmanay, things like that. But also, those references, also it's still used by the cricket team as well. But that reference there to the police and their role in stopping drunks coming in. You can look at our police records and you can see the impact on the town of when the Northern Meeting was happening. And there's a couple of police officers, so we hold what's called record and defaulters books, which give information about each police officer, meritorious acts, things they've done well, and things that have caused concern in their conduct. And there are a couple of police who are drafted in to support the Northern Meeting when it's in town, and there are also a couple of police having comments against them and maybe demotions because of their own behaviour drinking during the Northern Meeting. It's quite funny. One of them, I'm sure, says something like that he's been drunk on duty, but as the Northern Meeting was in town, there's a logical reason for this. It's interesting as well, you maybe heard there talking about Lord Lovat being one of the leaders at this point. And all of the big families that I've previously spoken about through Learn with Lorna episodes play their role in this. So the Lovat Frasers are involved, the Lochiels are involved. And so in all of those individual collections, you can see the interaction. And it's absolutely indicative of a certain level of society at the time that they're involved in the establishment of schools, and involved in churches, the town council, things like the Northern Meeting. And so by using all of those collections, you get a much, much broader social picture. Also, the Northern Meeting, just worth pointing out at this point, has had a long connection to royalty. So George V, Edward VIII, George VI and Elizabeth II were all patrons. Princess Mary even attended, but that's a little bit later. The Northern Meeting centenary in 1888 was a triumph. There was a huge attendance. There were over 500 at the Northern Meeting balls. There was beautiful weather, which always helps, and it seems like an all-round good time was had by everybody. And I mentioned that the Northern Meeting, as would be expected of any organisation of this age, has had periods of great success and popularity and periods of decline and difficulty, and that centenary event was a huge moment of success. War and conflict, however, have impacted the Northern Meeting as much as they have impacted everything else in our history. But what's interesting in an organisation of this vintage is that it's not just the First and Second World War that have impacted. So there has been a noticeable effect on the Northern Meeting from everything from the Napoleonic Wars through the Boer Wars to the First and Second World Wars. All had an impact on that group of people who were often going off to lead fighting, had an impact on the numbers of people who were attending, on finances, but also on the very mood of people to celebrate and party. And that's something that we've seen in recent years as well, with COVID, that it's quite hard, or with Ukraine perhaps, that there are moments where you go, I don't know that the nation is in the right mood for celebrating at the moment, and that's happened as well. The pre-World War II years were difficult with the games. I'll start that whole sentence again. The pre-World War II years, so those interwar years, were difficult for various reasons, but particularly the games, the Highland Games that the Northern Meeting were running, were beset by problems. So Angus Ferry described it like this: the last straw came when it was discovered that the proposed dates for the 1939 Games clashed with the Nairn Games, and the Games Committee decided just to cancel. So just after 100 years after their start, the Northern Meeting Games came to an end. In the event, the magnitude of international events in August 1939 meant that they slipped away almost unnoticed, as once again members were turning their attention to their military responsibilities. So there has been a period of difficulty, of financial issue. There were some bad seasons that meant that the weather was, no one wanted to come and take part in the games. Various things happening in and around this time, and then eventually this 1939 Games, when there was a clash of dates, they just cancelled it. But it's a particularly kind of touching way that's worded, with the games almost slipped away because of the scale of international events and the fact that all the members were starting to turn their faces towards Europe again and what they would need to be delivering on the war front. The Second World War stopped everything in its tracks. And this is an extract that talks about this. Brigadier Kenneth Garner Smith remembers, and this is one of his memories, one of the most memorable occasions was the last ball before the war, held in 1938 under the shadows of court mourning for a member of the royal family and the Munich crisis. It reminded us uncomfortably of the famous ball by the Duchess of Richmond before the Battle of Waterloo. During the evening, the fleet was alerted, and naval officers attending the ball were quietly ordered to return to their ships. Happily, no battle ensued at that point, but in due course we were at war with Germany. And Captain Patrick Munro of Fowles recalls that as well, and he said, "It was a dramatic moment when the Chief Constable arrived in full uniform at the ball at about midnight. He had to wait for the Eightsome Reel to finish, of course, but then he had emerged on the balcony, there was a roll on the drums, and he announced that all the naval officers present were ordered to return to their ships immediately, and all the Royal Navy officers in their blue and gold set off hurriedly for Invergordon. When the declaration of war with Germany brought the Northern Meeting to an end for the next 6 years, the balls were not only a golden memory for those who went off to war, their revival was something which many looked forward to with keen anticipation from the unglamorous circumstances in which war had temporarily landed them. The minutes of the annual general meeting held on the 21st of September 1939 are an apt epitaph for the 1930s. And this is how they read. Present, Brigadier General D.A. McFarlane, Major David Ross, Secretary. There being no quorum, it was decided to adjourn the meeting to another date. And during World War II, as in World War I, and I haven't touched much on World War I today because I have done so many times previously through different stories, and you can imagine a very similar impact on the Northern Meeting. But World War II saw the use of the Northern Meeting rooms for the war effort, and of course that led to damage as it had done in the First World War. Some things re-emerged after the war. So for instance, the piping competitions, and I see your comment there, Margaret, thank heaven they kept the piping competitions. So some things did re-emerge, like the competitions. Others didn't. The Northern Meeting Games did not reappear. And in 1946, the Northern Meeting Park was sold to the council for £5,750, and that's why we now use it for those kind of community events. By the 1950s, the balls were being held in September and December, and over the generations the dates of the Northern Meeting have changed according to when they thought they might get the best attendance, not to clash with other things, and so on. But by the 1950s, balls were being held in September and December, with the December one taking its feel from the charity dances that had been held at Christmas throughout the war years, so more relaxed, more informal, as opposed to the other ball, which retained and retains a very, very formal standard of dress, of dance, and of expectations on behaviour and so on. The 1940s saw the sale of the Northern Meeting Park, and the 1960s saw the sale of the Northern Meeting Rooms, that grand ballroom and rooms on Church Street. Angus Ferry described it in the book as hard a decision to take as selling the family home. However, they needed to do it because the Northern Meeting at this point needed the money, and Inverness was undergoing a huge amount of property redevelopment, something which remains a contentious decision to this day. I'm sure someone will have a comment about that. So the Northern Meeting Rooms were sold to the council in the 1960s, and within a year or so they had been demolished. The Northern Meeting struggled to find a similar space, and over the next few decades their Christmas and summer balls were held in Aviemore, in Inverness, at the Caledonian Hotel and in the Station Hotel, but they didn't really match what they had had in the Northern Meeting Rooms. They nearly invested heavily in the construction of Eden Court Theatre, but in the end they didn't, although they did use it and continue still to use Eden Court for the piping competitions. The Northern Meeting is still an active organisation which, thanks to the Northern Meeting Trust, still runs the piping competition, And that, as you maybe, if you're not familiar with it, you're maybe getting through some of the comments how prestigious the piping competition remains today. So people come from across the world to take part and compete in the Northern Meeting piping competition. That still from its roots of that 1841 Northern Meeting. In addition, they still host the Northern Meeting balls, and that same focus, right in that original meeting in 1788, there's still focus there on dance, on dress, on enjoyment and pleasure. They no longer host the Inverness Highland Games, which are now delivered by High Life Highland on behalf of the Games Committee and the City Events and Festivals Group. The Northern Meeting now has a charity arm, so that was set up in 2015 to make grants to charitable organisations across the north of Scotland with a particular focus on young and disadvantaged people. COVID, of course, put a halt to some of the Northern Meetings activities, and their events were cancelled in 2019 and 2020. But the reason I'm mentioning that, because of course that's past and they're operational again, not running events again, but the reason I mention that is because there can't be that many organisations in the Highlands that had the same problem in 2020 that they had in 1832 when they had to postpone because of the cholera outbreak. A story of this length necessarily has its highs and lows. Its ebbs in popularity, in finance, in attendance and so on. Finally, I wanted to say, as I have said before, I've used this book of Angus Fairies to tell this story, but I wanted to reiterate that although I've done this out of a book, which is very unusual for me, all the records relating to the Northern Meeting, the minute books and so on are held in the Highland Archive Centre. So this was just a quick route in for me to get to the collection. The collection includes the 1788 Constitution, the minutes from 1788 through to 2008, including membership lists, financial records, legal and property documents, and that's where some of those 1500s documents are, because as they've bought property, they've been given the legal documents relating to them. Admin and correspondence files. There's information and papers relating to the games, relating to the Northern Meeting Trust, other social activities as well. It's an extensive collection, and it gives an insight not only to the Northern Meeting, but into the social history of the Highlands over the last 230 years. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about it. As I said at the beginning, some of you will be very familiar with the phrase the Northern Meeting and some will be new to it, but I hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit about it. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope that you'll join me next week when I am looking at the subject of art and artists across our collections. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that. Thank you.